This is the Strong is a Mindset podcast, episode number 205. If you've ever felt like giving up because you're working hard and not seeing results fast enough, let's talk about it. This is the Strong is a Mindset podcast, where you'll learn how to build both a strong body and a strong mind by eating, moving, and thinking. I'm your host, physician, personal trainer, certified health coach, and certified life coach, Carrie Holland. Hey, how are you? What's new? What's good? So, what's good here? We are going to talk about what happens when you want to quit. Honestly, I think this is one of the most important parts of change that we can talk about because it comes up all the time, in coaching, in fitness, in weight loss, in habit change, in careers, relationships, basically anything where you're trying to improve or do something differently than you've done before. At some point, usually sooner than you expected, there's a moment where your brain goes, maybe I should just stop. This isn't working. I'm wasting my time. I'm never going to change. This is too hard. I should quit. And I want to normalize this from the outset because I have heard every single one of these from clients at some point in my coaching career. So if you've had thoughts like this, you're absolutely not alone at all. In fact, I would argue that wanting to quit is part of the process for a lot of people, especially high-achieving women who are used to being competent, capable, successful, productive, and good at things fairly quickly. Because one of the most vulnerable moments in change is when you realize, whoa, okay, this is going to take a lot longer than I thought. And that moment right there, that is where a lot of people start spiraling. And I saw this come up recently with a client. I don't need to get into all the specifics, but she had been putting in effort. She was trying. She was paying attention to her food. She was making changes. And she got really upset because she felt like she was doing all this work, but nothing was changing fast enough. And in a moment of frustration, she thought she should just quit coaching altogether. And honestly, I get it. I really do. Because I think what was underneath that moment was discouragement, frustration, impatience, exhaustion, and probably some fear too, all smashed together. Fear that maybe this wouldn't work out for her, or fear that she would put in all this effort and still not get the outcome she wanted. And I think what makes this especially challenging is that people dramatically underestimate how long meaningful change actually takes. But because of the world and the culture we live in, where there are before and after selfies, lightning fast transformations, dramatic headlines, and messaging that screams, I changed my whole life in 30 days, it all makes sense. People start expecting immediate reassurance that what they're doing is working. And when they don't get that reassurance fast enough, they panic. And they assume slow progress means no progress. And that is where we're going today. We're going to talk about why the urge to quit is normal and why it shows up, and why it does not automatically mean that you should quit. We'll also talk about the difference between reevaluating versus emotional escaping, because these are very different. And then we're going to talk about what to do when your brain starts wigging out and telling you this is taking too long. Because if you're in the middle of building healthier habits, changing your mindset, losing weight, exercising consistently, improving your relationship with food, or really changing anything meaningful in your life, there is a very good chance that at some point you're going to want to quit. And I don't think that means you're broken. It means you're human. So let's go. Let's talk about the expectations for a second. Because honestly, I think this is one of the biggest reasons that people want to quit so quickly. I think many of us have the underlying expectation that if we're putting in effort, we should feel or look noticeably different pretty quickly. Like if we're trying hard enough, being disciplined enough, or paying enough attention, then surely something should be happening by now. We want reassurance that our effort is working. We want proof. And honestly, I get that, especially if you're uncomfortable, and especially if changing your habits requires a lot more thought, effort, planning, and emotional energy than what you were doing before. Of course, you want to know that it's paying off. But I think where people get tripped up is that they expect years of patterns to shift after a few weeks of effort. And I see this all the time with clients. Someone starts paying more attention to protein. They're meal planning a little more. They're exercising more consistently than they were before. They're trying to cut back on nighttime eating. They're making changes that are no doubt better than what they were doing previously. But then a few weeks go by and they're frustrated because they don't feel or look dramatically different yet. And I want to say this very gently, but also very honestly. A few weeks of eating more protein is not going to undo years of inconsistent eating patterns. And that's not failure at all. That's just reality. It's the same way that one good night of sleep doesn't suddenly reverse years of exhaustion, or one therapy session doesn't suddenly heal years of anxiety or people-pleasing or perfectionism. Things that were built over long periods of time usually take time to unwind too. But I think we've really lost perspective on this culturally, and it makes sense. We're surrounded by crazy extreme transformations and stories of change where it looks like someone woke up one day, drank more water, lifted some weights, and suddenly became a completely different person 6 weeks later. And I think that really, really messes with people's expectations. Because what you don't see are the people who spent months and months grinding away where nothing felt exciting. You don't see the repetition. You don't see the inconsistency they had to work through, or the self-doubt, or the times they wanted to quit. You don't see the boring, ordinary middle of behavior change where someone is mostly just trying to keep showing up. That does not go viral on TikTok. And the middle part is usually where people start panicking. Because in the beginning, motivation is often pretty high. You're excited. You made a decision. Maybe you bought new workout clothes, or cleaned out the pantry, or downloaded a tracking app. So there's momentum there. But eventually, that novelty wears off, and then you're left with the actual work of repeating behaviors before they feel rewarding. And that is the part that can feel really underwhelming. Because now you're just making another lunch, or going for another walk, or planning another workout, or trying again after an imperfect weekend. And over time, people start wondering, is this it? Is this even doing anything? And I think this is where so many people misinterpret what's happening. They assume that because progress feels slow, that nothing is happening at all. But slow progress and no progress are not the same thing, not at all. But you have to be looking for it in order to find it. Sometimes progress looks like you recovering faster after a greasy off-plan meal instead of spiraling for a full week. Or it looks like noticing your habits sooner. Or it looks like noticing your negative self-talk as it's happening and stopping it mid-sentence because you know where it leads you, nowhere good. And sometimes progress looks like you staying in the game emotionally, even though you're frustrated. All of that matters a lot, even if it feels small. But often, because it's not dramatic, people dismiss them. They keep looking for some huge, obvious moment where things click and feel easy and certain. But if I'm going to give it to you straight, most meaningful change does not happen that way. Real change is usually a lot quieter than that. It's repetitive, it's a little boring, it's gradual, but it compounds over time. And I think part of the work here is learning how to tolerate the phase where the effort is real, but the payoff still feels far away. That phase is normal, 100% normal. And it does not mean you're failing. That is just what change looks like when you're in the middle of it. It feels uncomfortable on the inside and doesn't look like much happening on the outside. And that is a hard sell, I know. But let's stay with this for a minute because I think there's a really important question to ask yourself when you feel the urge to quit something that matters to you. So let's say you do quit. Then what? And I don't mean that in a sarcastic or judgment way at all. I mean it honestly. Really walk yourself through that. If you stop trying to change what you're eating, or stop exercising, or stop paying attention to your habits altogether, then what happens? What changes? Because in the moment, quitting can feel incredibly appealing, especially when you're discouraged or frustrated or tired of thinking about food and exercise and habits. There can be this feeling of, I just don't want to deal with this anymore. And honestly, I get that. And I think what's happening in those moments is not that people suddenly stop caring about their goals. Most of the time, it's the opposite. They care a whole lot. They still want to feel healthier. They still want to feel more comfortable in their body. They still want more energy, more confidence, more consistency, all of it. But what they want in the moment is relief. They want relief from feeling disappointed or from feeling uncertain. They want relief from feeling like they're trying so hard and not getting where they want to go fast enough. They want relief from the emotional weight of wanting something so badly, but not yet having proof that it's working. And quitting will temporarily give you that relief. For a minute, it feels like you can exhale, like you can breathe, like you can stop thinking about it and stop trying and stop wondering if this is ever going to work. But the reason I think it's so important to really look at that urge to quit is because most of the time, quitting doesn't actually resolve the deeper issue. Not at all. It just creates some distance between you and the discomfort for a little while. But eventually, for most people, the desire comes back. They still want to feel better in their body. They still want more energy. They still want to feel more in control around food. They still want the life or the habits or the confidence that they were originally working for. So then what often happens is they circle back around and start all over again. And I think that cycle is exhausting for people. That cycle of starting over, getting discouraged, quitting, feeling bad about quitting, and trying again, over and over. And after enough cycles of that, many people stop trusting themselves. And it's not because they're incapable of change, but because they've practiced leaving every time things start feeling uncomfortable, uncertain, repetitive, or slow. And I want to be careful here because I'm not saying you should never stop doing something. I think there are absolutely situations where goals change, priorities shift, or a certain approach is genuinely not working. Sometimes stopping something is thoughtful and intentional and completely appropriate. But I think that is very, very different from emotionally reacting in a moment of discouragement and deciding that because something feels uncomfortable, it must not be working. And honestly, I think this is one of the hardest parts of change for so many people. Learning how to tolerate the emotional roller coaster of not being where you want to be yet. That is huge because there is vulnerability in continuing. There's vulnerability in putting in effort before you have certainty. There's vulnerability in trying again after being disappointed before. And when you feel that vulnerability, your brain starts looking for a way out. That's why I think it's so important not to immediately treat every thought of, I want to quit, as hard truth. Sometimes it's just your brain trying to protect you from discomfort. And that is very, very different from deciding something no longer matters to you. And I think this leads into something else that's really important to understand, especially if you're someone who tends to second guess yourself the minute things start feeling hard. Wanting to quit does not automatically mean you should quit. I really want that to sink in for a second. Because I think one of the biggest mistakes people make during change is assuming that if they feel discouraged, doubtful, impatient, frustrated, or emotionally tired, then something must have gone wrong. Like the emotional discomfort itself becomes evidence that the process isn't working. But honestly, those feelings are super common when you're working through change, especially long-term change, and especially when you're trying to undo patterns that you've had for years or even decades. So yes, there are going to be days when you feel impatient. And there are most definitely going to be times when you wonder if any of this is working. And there are going to be emotional lows where you feel less motivated, less excited, or less confident than you did when you started. But that does not automatically mean you're failing. Most people feel uncomfortable with uncertainty, and we feel like we have to correct it. So we look for reassurance or proof. We want to know the effort is going to pay off before we fully commit to continuing. But here's the thing. So much of change requires that you continue before you know that it's working. And that is hard. Meaning, it is hard to keep showing up when your results don't match the amount of effort you feel like you're putting in. It is hard to show up and put in your reps when you don't feel transformed yet. It's hard to stay consistent when your brain keeps offering ideas like, this is taking too long. Maybe this isn't working. And I think a lot of people interpret those thoughts as truth instead of recognizing them as a very normal part of the process. So think about it. Any real change involves a messy middle. The messy middle is that period where you're starting to shake the person you were, but you also don't feel entirely like the new person you're becoming yet either. And that messy, gray middle area can feel really uncomfortable because you haven't fully wired in the habits yet. You haven't built the confidence yet, and you don't completely trust yourself yet. So emotionally, this all can feel super shaky. But shaky doesn't mean wrong. And this is where staying in the game really, really matters. Because when you stay with yourself and stay with the process, instead of abandoning it, you stop expecting your emotions to cooperate perfectly before you continue. That means you understand that consistency is not about feeling amazing all the time, not at all. Instead, it's about practicing the behaviors long enough for them to compound and long enough for them to become more automatic and long enough for the identity shift to catch up with your actions. And really, that's where your self-trust gets built, not at the beginning when everything feels new and exciting. Self-trust gets built when you have a terrible week and you continue anyway. Or when you have an imperfect weekend and don't let it spiral. Or when you feel frustrated that the progress is slow, but you stay with it instead of blowing it all up and quitting. That is the work. And I really want to normalize this because I think too many people assume that successful people must somehow not experience doubt or discouragement or impatience, but they do. The difference is that they don't automatically interpret those feelings as a reason to stop. So now, with all of this said, I do want to add some nuance here because I don't want this episode to come across like I'm saying you should just force yourself through absolutely everything forever, no matter what. That is not what I mean. Sometimes stopping is appropriate. Sometimes goals genuinely change. Sometimes a certain approach really is not working for you. Or other times your priorities shift, your life circumstances change, or you realize that something you thought you wanted actually doesn't align anymore. That happens. And I think being able to recognize that is important. But I also think there's a very big difference between reevaluating something and emotionally reacting in a discouraged moment. And I think that's where things get a little fuzzy for people. Because when you feel frustrated, uncomfortable, impatient, embarrassed, or doubtful, it can suddenly feel like your entire plan is wrong. It can feel like, well, maybe I shouldn't do this at all. Maybe this isn't for me. Maybe I should just quit altogether. But sometimes what's really happening is that you're having a hard emotional moment in the process of pursuing your goal. That does not mean you give up on the goal, though. Those are not the same thing. You can think about it through the lens of exercise as an example. So sometimes someone decides, hey, you know what? Training for a marathon right now, that does not fit in with my life. That is thoughtful reevaluation. But that is very different from, I had a rough week, I missed a few workouts, I feel behind, so now I'm deciding I'm not a runner and I should just quit altogether. Do you see the difference here? One is intentional. One is reactive. One decision comes from clarity, the other is coming from discomfort. And honestly, I think many people make major decisions about themselves in the middle of emotional lows. They decide, I can't do this. Nothing works for me. I'll never change. This is pointless. And then they build an entire story around their temporary emotional state. But feelings are not always reliable, especially when they come in the middle of frustration or when you're tired or discouraged or disappointed. So I think it's super important to slow yourself down before making big decisions in emotional moments. Before you dramatically quit the thing, ask yourself, do I actually want to stop doing this? Or do I just hate how this feels right now? Because there is a difference between thoughtfully deciding something no longer fits in your life and abruptly abandoning something because you don't like how it feels in the messy middle. And honestly, sometimes the answer is that something needs to change. But maybe what needs to change is the approach and not the entire goal. So maybe that means your workouts need to be shorter, or your nutrition goals need to be simpler, or maybe you need more support, or maybe your timeline needs some adjusting, or maybe you need to stop expecting perfection, or maybe you need to stop trying to overhaul your life in the span of 2 weeks. That is very different from deciding none of this works, so peace out. Because people often swing between extremes. They either force themselves rigidly through something that does not fit their lives and isn't working, or they completely abandon themselves in the process the second things feel hard. And usually, the answer is somewhere in the middle. Usually, the work is learning how to stay honest and flexible without immediately escaping the discomfort of change. And here's another thing I want to point out that most of us already know, but I think it bears repeating. The real work of change is actually pretty boring. I know that's not a good sell, but it's the truth. Most meaningful change is not dramatic. In fact, it's pretty subtle. It's repetitive. It's doing a lot of the same very ordinary things over and over again before they feel rewarding or automatic. And I think that's where so many people struggle because they expect transformation to feel more inspiring than it does in real life. But it's not the grand gestures that usually change you. It's the small things that are repeated consistently enough that they eventually become part of who you are. And people often get tripped up here because the middle of change can feel very unimpressive when it's happening. You're just packing another lunch or making another plate of eggs for breakfast or doing another workout or getting your steps in or drinking your water or going to bed a little earlier. It is the same basic things you already know help you feel better. And part of your brain revolts and resists because it wants novelty. It wants excitement. It wants a dramatic breakthrough moment where suddenly everything feels different. But honestly, most habits become mundane before they become your identity. And that's so important to understand, like deep in your bones. Before you see yourself as a healthy person or a runner or someone who follows through, there's usually a long, boring, even uncertain stretch where you're just practicing those behaviors repeatedly without yet fully believing in the identity. And I think that can feel very vulnerable and awkward because you don't fully feel like a new person, but you're trying to act like it anyway. So you're trying to become someone who meal preps and plans consistently when historically you've eaten takeout 5 or more nights a week. Or you're trying to become someone who exercises regularly when your old pattern was to stop anytime things got stressful. Or you're trying to become someone who follows through when before you were constantly on again, off again. But all of that takes reps. It takes showing up for yourself and for your habits over and over again. And honestly, I think a lot of people quit right before those reps would have started compounding. Often, they leave in the middle when the work feels repetitive, the excitement is gone, and the payoff feels farther away than they expected. But that middle part is the process. That's the process. That's where consistency gets built, and that's where the habits get wired in. Not during the big motivational burst at the beginning. It's during the ordinary Thursdays where you keep on keeping on. And I think willingness matters a lot here too, because at some level, behavior change requires being willing to experience some boredom, some repetition, some inconvenience, some imperfection, and some delayed gratification without using those things as reasons to quit. Sometimes, really oftentimes, the work is staying with the basics long enough for them to actually do their job. And the work that changes people is usually the exact work that people are most tempted to quit because it does not feel dramatic when it's happening. So, if you're in one of those moments right now where you feel discouraged, frustrated, impatient, or tempted to throw it all out the window, let's talk about what to do instead of quitting. Because when people hit this point, they often swing to extremes. They think their only two options are push harder or completely give up, and neither one works very well. So, first, I would encourage you to really zoom out. Stop evaluating your progress day to day. Seriously, stop doing that to yourself. Because when you evaluate change in 24-hour increments, of course, it is going to feel like nothing is happening. Real change is generally way too gradual to measure that way. So instead, compare yourself to 3 months ago, or 6 months ago, a year ago. Look at the bigger picture. Are you more aware of your habits now? Are you recovering faster after hard days? Are you spiraling less? Are you exercising more consistently than you used to? Are you more intentional with food than you were before? Are you starting over faster instead of disappearing for 3 weeks? I think people dismiss progress all the time because it doesn't look dramatic. They're so focused on the scale or the measurable outcome that they completely overlook the shifts that are happening underneath it all. And honestly, some of those more subtle shifts are the exact thing that add up to long-term change. I've seen this so many times with clients. A woman will tell me nothing is changing, but then in the same conversation, she'll mention that she used to spiral for a week after an off-plan meal, but now she recovers by the next one. Or she'll say she's frustrated with her progress, but 6 months ago, she wasn't exercising at all, and now she's lifting 3 days a week consistently. And all of that matters, and all of that is progress. And another idea I want to add here is this. Stop making emotional moments into permanent decisions. I honestly think this is huge. Not every moment of discouragement or disappointment deserves a life decision attached to it. Just because you had a hard week does not mean your whole plan is wrong. Feeling frustrated today does not mean you need to completely reinvent your approach by tomorrow morning. Sometimes you're just discouraged. Sometimes you're tired. Sometimes you had unrealistic expectations and now you're confronting the reality that change takes longer than you wanted it to. That is uncomfortable, for sure, but that's very different from failure. And I also think that when people get overwhelmed, they start projecting way too far into the future. They start thinking things like, I can't do this forever. This is going to take years. I'm never going to get there. And honestly, I don't think that's a useful place to focus because when your brain starts spiraling like that, it turns the entire rest of your life into this impossible mountain, and it's no wonder you want to quit. So instead, I think it's much more helpful to come back to the next right step. Not the next 6 months, not your final goal, just the next thing in front of you. We're talking really, really small here. So maybe that's planning your next meal, or getting to your workout tomorrow, or going grocery shopping instead of ordering takeout again. Or maybe it's getting back on track after a rough weekend without turning it into a full emotional freakout. That is the stuff that moves the needle, and that's the stuff that matters. Because real change is usually much less dramatic than people think it's going to be. It's often just continuing to take reasonably good care of yourself over and over again, especially on the days when your brain is trying to convince you it's pointless. And finally, I really want to normalize the emotional dip that happens during change because I think many people interpret that dip as proof that they're doing something wrong. But remember, nothing is wrong if this got harder than you expected. You are not incapable because your motivation faded. You are not failing because you got discouraged. A lot of this is simply the emotional reality of trying to change long-standing patterns and stay with something long enough to see results from it. And honestly, I don't even think the goal is to never feel discouraged. I think that's impossible. And I think the goal is learning not to treat discouragement like it's an emergency. And instead, you recognize, okay, this is a hard moment, instead of this means I should quit everything. So, if you take anything from this episode, I think it's this. Be careful about making big decisions about yourself in isolated emotional moments. Because I think a lot of people quit in moments of frustration and later realize they actually didn't want to stop. They just wanted the discomfort to stop. They wanted reassurance. They wanted relief or proof that the effort was worth it. And unfortunately, a lot of change requires continuing for a while before you fully get that proof. That is the hard part. Not because the habits themselves are so hard, but because staying with something long enough to let it work requires serious patience. It requires repetition, and it requires being willing to continue even when the emotional payoff is delayed. And honestly, that's where the self-trust really gets built. Not when everything feels easy and exciting at the beginning. Anybody can feel motivated on day one. But self-trust gets built in the middle, in the ordinary, repetitive, sometimes frustrating stretch where you keep showing up anyway. And if you can learn to do that, if you can learn how to stay with yourself through the slower, less glamorous part of change, instead of constantly escaping it, that changes everything. And if you want help with this, let's go. When you coach with me, we work through the exact patterns that pull you out of consistency, like all or nothing thinking, impatience, and the urge to quit when progress feels slower than you hoped. We work on helping you stay in the game long enough to actually build habits and self-trust that lasts. Check out my website, send me a message at www.carriehollandmd.com/contact, and let's talk about how coaching can help you stop blowing things up every time change gets uncomfortable. All right? Thank you again for hanging out with me, and I'll catch you again next week. Hey, if you want to build muscle but don't know where to start, I've got you covered. Head over to carriehollandmd.com/buildstrength and download my free guide to help you maximize your strength training. Inside, you'll find the essential exercises for building muscle, plus simple 1, 2, and 3-day workout plans that you can follow with just dumbbells and a bench. You'll also find strength training tips to help you train smarter and see real results. My goal is to help you get strong, and this strength training guide will help you do it. Go to carriehollandmd.com/buildstrength and check it out. Thank you for listening to the Strong is a Mindset podcast. If you want to learn more about how to build both a strong mind and a strong body by eating, moving, and most importantly, thinking, check out carriehollandmd.com.